Okay, so we're going to get started. Thanks everyone for taking time out of your day to attend this webinar. Before we begin, please note that there are two ways to listen to this webinar. The first and preferred method is using your computer speakers, but alternatively you may dial into the local number provided on this slide and input the webinar access code and audio pin when prompted. If you have any questions throughout the course of the webinar, please type them into the questions window on the right-hand side of your display. We have earmarked some time at the end of the webinar to answer as many questions as possible. However, due to time limitations, we will not have an opportunity to answer every one. Okay, so as we're about to get started, I'll begin by introducing myself. My name is Ian MacDonald. I'm Director of Consumer Marketing at Trader, and I'm going to be delivering the first part of the webinar. And then for the second half, I'm going to hand over to Chuck Lee, who is Senior Product Manager of Digital Strategy and Solutions. Chuck is a stakeholder of our solutions product mix, and internally he's considered as the go-to guy for all things Dealer Smart Solutions related. Over the past few weeks, Chuck has been working closely with Dealer.com to ensure that all of our website technology and products are capable of abiding by Canada's new anti-spam legislation, and so he's best suited to offer insight regarding these aspects. So today's webinar is subdivided into three components as follows. In part one, we'll be giving an overview of the new anti-spam law governing commercial electronic messages. Then in part two, we'll talk about best practices around complying with this new legislation. And then finally in part three, we'll be talking about what we've done on our end to ensure that our product and technology are able to abide by the letter of the law. Please do note the disclaimer on this slide. This webinar is intended to provide a brief overview of Canada's anti-spam legislation. It is not intended to be a fulsome review, nor is it intended to provide any legal advice. It is not advised that customers act on information in this document without first seeking advice from appropriate legal counsel. So, Canada's anti-spam legislation, what is it? Okay, so otherwise termed as CASL or CASL, it's a new law that regulates the sending of commercial electronic messages. The legislation has been established to protect Canadians from spam messages whilst ensuring that Canadian businesses can remain competitive on the global stage. The majority of the provisions around this legislation will take effect from July 1st, 2014, and will be followed by the potential of lawsuits beginning July 1st, 2017. For a complete breakdown of the law itself, please visit www.fightspam.gc.ca. So you heard me mention a commercial electronic message just then, so we're just going to quickly touch on what is a commercial electronic message. Well, the way that it's been defined within the legislation is a communication to any target recipient that encourages participation in a commercial activity. So this can include advertisements, information about promotions, product or service offers, business opportunities, and so on. These commercial messages most typically take the form of an email communication, a text message, an instant message, or it could be a message delivered through social networks. So to summarize, here are some key points to help you determine if your messages are considered commercial electronic messages. If you send a message that encourages the recipient to buy something, it is a CEM. If you send a message that urges the recipient to give you permission to send them a CEM, this is also itself a CEM. CASL applies to every individual, incorporated or unincorporated business or non-profit organization that sends electronic messages for any commercial purpose. CASL also applies to everyone who sends electronic messages for commercial purposes, including individuals, incorporated and unincorporated businesses, not-for-profit organizations, and so forth. But the main thing that you need to understand from all of this is that it does apply to you. So let's talk about consent. So consent, which could otherwise be known as permission or opt-in, is a prerequisite to send a commercial electronic message to an intended recipient. Consent in the context of CASL can be either expressed or implied. It's important to understand that you cannot send a commercial electronic message without consent after July the 1st, 2014. And furthermore, deployment of a commercial electronic message requesting consent from your existing contacts in your database is not permitted after July 1st, 2014. So if you need to email your database asking them for their express consent, then you must do it by that date. You can't send it after that date, even if it's not an advertisement in itself. So, how to obtain and maintain consent? To obtain express consent, you must ensure the following. You must clearly describe the purposes for requesting consent. You must provide the name by which the person seeking consent carries on business, and, if different, identify on whose behalf consent is sought. Provide contact information in the form of a physical mailing address and one of a phone number, email address, or website address of those persons seeking consent, and indicate the recipient of the CEM can unsubscribe and offer an option to do so. What is important to note under CASL is that the burden of proving that you have appropriately obtained consent from each recipient is on you, not on the recipient. For this reason, it is important to have proper tracking in place should any regulatory body, such as the CRTC, come knocking on your door. So let's talk about express consent. Under CASL, express consent is defined as an affirmative indication that the intended recipient desires to receive CEMs, and it can be obtained via any of the following ways. It could be a contact or inquiry form on a website. It could be registration for a contest or a coupon. It could be registration at a point of sale, or registration over the phone. Please note that pre-selecting consent on a form is prohibited. So you can see in the illustrations to the right-hand side, pre-checking the consent box is prohibited. Rather, the checkboxes must be presented as deselected by default, and the party submitting the consent form must take the active action of checking the box themselves in order to provide permission or opt-in. Implied consent. CASL provides that consent is implied in certain circumstances, including when there is an established relationship between the sender and the intended recipient. Implied consent most typically takes the form of an existing business relationship or existing non-business relationship. This type of consent can also apply to someone who has clearly published his or her email address online. However, do note that within implied consent, the message deployed to the target recipient must relate to his or her business role or function in order to ensure that it is not categorized as spam. Here's an important recommendation. Although implied consent falls within the letter of the law, it is still advisable to obtain express consent with a clear tie back to how, when, and where consent was initially established. Implied consent by its nature is open-ended and can potentially result in consumer complaints and potential legal ramifications or penalties. So the recommendation is to play it safe, especially around this area, because it can get a little bit grey. So there are some exemptions. According to CASL, consent is not required for messages sent between employees and staff within an organization, between organizations that have an established and ongoing business relationship, or to respond to a complaint, an inquiry, or to satisfy a legal obligation. Furthermore, with the above message types, there is no requirement to include prescribed information or an unsubscribe mechanism, which we'll provide further details on the next slide. Please note that when sending messages between organizations, the messages must relate to the activities of the recipient organization. So, mandatory components of a CEM. Under CASL, every CEM must do the following. Identify the name by which the person sending the CEM carries on business and identify on whose behalf the message is sent, if that's different. Provide contact information for both of the above, meaning a valid physical mailing address and one of a legitimate phone number, email address, or website address. The mandatory contact details that are provided within the CEM must be valid for a minimum of 60 days after the message is sent. They must provide a trouble-free process that allows the target recipient of the CEM to unsubscribe at no cost via reply to the email address, such as unsubscribe@yourdomain.com, or a web page with an unsubscribe form. Please note that if a recipient unsubscribes from your email marketing program or CEMs, you must ensure that no additional messages are sent to him or her within 10 business days. You must have a system for updating the contact's preferences in your database within 10 business days. Speaking of your database and maintaining records, according to CASL, the burden of proving express or implied consent is your responsibility, and therefore a key piece is proper record maintenance. A record of how consent was acquired is a compulsory component. Breaking this down, for express consent, an electronic database, paper records, audio files, or other means to record the time, date, circumstances, and active permission of the receiver is recommended. For implied consent, which is the riskier of the two consent types that we've described, a record of the nature of the relationship and record of any two-way communications is suggested. For example, copies of previous electronic communication. So now that we've learned more about the legislation itself, we'll just quickly touch on why you should care. And here are the top 4 reasons why this is so important to yourselves that you abide by the rules and regulations imposed by this new legislation. First is that the potential of fines up to $10 million for a single violation is quite sizable. Secondly is injunctions and private right of action after July 1st, 2017. Thirdly is the possibility of class action lawsuits, again after July 1st, 2017. And then lastly, of course, there's bad publicity and public representation which can result from spamming contacts. As we have covered the legislation with a fine-tooth comb now, we're ready to dive into the next 2 sections of the webinar. So I'm going to introduce you to Chuck Lee, who I mentioned earlier, Senior Product Manager of Digital Strategy and Solutions at Trader, to provide some insight pertaining to best practices and the changes to our own solutions to help our customers work towards compliance with CASL.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So let's get right into this section of the webinar and run through best practices along with the requirements from your end to ensure compliance with Canada's anti-spam legislation. We will also, at a high level, shed some light on certain changes coming to our DSS product, particularly within web forms and back-end tracking control center. A recommended method to certify compliance with Canada's anti-spam legislation is to build a plan via the following list. Make CASL requirements a priority by committing resources and budget to the initiative. Review the legislation, define required deliverables, and execute against them. Certify that all collection of emails and contact information have express consent with an opt-in. Remove expired contact records from your database for whom you do not have express consent before the CASL effective date of July 1st, 2014. Try to obtain express consent from your existing contacts and customers and track opt-ins leveraging your internal systems or systems. To safeguard against possible consumer complaints, establish an auditable process that demonstrates compliance with the legislation and use up-to-date tools to track all activities related to contact, customer, or lead records in your database. So to demonstrate compliance with Canada's anti-spam legislation, the following assessments and adjustments are recommended. For your existing records, review your database of contacts and customers and categorize or flag each record based on consent type, express, implied, or no consent. It is recommended to remove contacts from your database for whom you do not have consent, or alternatively, try to obtain consent both before July 1st, 2014. As for your website, scrutinize your existing opt-in process embedded within web forms against CASL requirements and ensure the following is included. 1. Clearly describe the purposes for requesting consent. 2. An affirmative indication that the intended recipient desires to receive CEMs. And 3. Registrant can consent to receive CEMs on his or her own, wherein the party submitting the consent form can take the active action of checking the box to provide permission. You may also consider updating your website privacy policy and terms of use if applicable. Continuing with recommendations pertaining to assessment and adjustments, let's take a deep dive into your digital marketing communications with contacts, prospects, and customers and ensure the following is included. Full disclosure of your business name and email and all required contact details, including physical mailing address and one of email address, a telephone number, or a website address are incorporated, and a simple, prominently displayed, and cost-free unsubscribe mechanism to ensure the target recipient can withdraw consent at any time that can be tracked via your internal system or systems. Existing contact records within your internal systems must also be adjusted to track submitted contact details and consent choice, particularly express consent, implied consent, or no consent. Necessary date and timestamps for each contact record, and an efficient and effective means to manage opt-outs for unsubscribes. Finally, and perhaps the most essential adjustment, train your employees and staff to establish awareness of the new compliant process and the requirements of Canada's anti-spam legislation. So what does this mean for you? Let's look at what this means to you. First off, dealers who desire to send CEMs must obtain consent for each individual prospect or customer by reconfirming consent for existing contacts before July 1st, 2014, and additionally, obtaining express consent for new leads or prospects after July 1st, 2014. Furthermore, going forward, it is imperative to appreciate the changes to process, solutions, and communications. The foremost tracking consent status where you have 1. Properly obtained express consent, 2. Do not have express or logical implied consent, or 3. Consent is not selected or entered. What you must understand is that leads or contacts that have not provided express consent cannot be targeted with commercial electronic messages. Doing so can open the floodgates for potential complaints, investigations from official governing bodies, or even worse, lawsuits. In continuing with changes to process, solutions, and communications, the following adjustments will be made to Trader Solutions, which we'll detail in subsequent slides. CASL compliant consent notice can be enabled on all forms hosted within your Dealer SmartSide Solutions website, and the forms will contain corresponding consent and non-consent checkboxes and the hyperlinks to your privacy policy and your Contact Us page. From the back end, Control Center will maintain a date and timestamp along with consent choice for stored lead records and updates in real time based on contact's updated status. So for instance, if in subsequent form submissions or email communications a contact opts out, the corresponding record in Control Center will reflect this change. As usual, all leads are stored in chronological order under each contact in Control Center, which will provide you with a historical log of all actions performed by that contact. Finally, our solution is now able to embed prescribed information into email messages sent from within Control Center, including scripted information, including your business name and email address, contact details, including one or more of a physical mailing address, telephone number, website address, and an option to unsubscribe. Please also note that a pre-canned unsubscribe page will be developed and launched to enable tracking of contacts who desire to opt out of your email marketing program or be targeted with additional CEMs. If you use an external email service provider, be sure to check that your systems are also updated. So the chart below outlines the changes to the process behind the submission of a form within your site. Based on the consent choice, you will go through each one of these in subsequent slides. So we basically have, yes, I consent, no, I do not consent, or 3, there's no answer, or this consent was not specified. So when a consumer clicks yes, I consent, they have obtained consent. The first scenario is when you have obtained consent from a form submission. What you can do is broken down as follows. Respond to the inquiry and add the contact to your email marketing program and target him or her with additional CEMs, including promotions or specials, your weekly, monthly, or quarterly newsletter, invitations to events, and so forth. Please note that this only applies to consenting leads obtained via form submission through your Dealer Smart Solutions website. Leads from the autoTRADER.ca marketplace do not apply. Also note that if a contact unsubscribes or opts out, you have 10 days to ensure the contact record is updated and must not target him or her with any further CEMs. The second scenario is when you have not obtained consent from a form submission, where the submitting party selects no to the consent choice. What you can do is respond to the original inquiry only and carry on the conversation only when a response is requested or required. You are not permitted to add non-consenting contacts to your email marketing program and target these individuals with any additional CEMs. Please note that this scenario applies to non-consenting leads obtained via form submissions through your Dealer Smart Solutions website and to inbound leads from the autoTRADER marketplace. The final scenario pertains to individuals who have not selected a consent choice through a web form submission. What you can do with this type of contact is as follows. Respond to the original inquiry and add the contact to your email marketing program and target with additional CEMs for a period of 6 months only, as this assumes that an existing business relationship has been created. However, what's important to reaffirm is that if the contact unsubscribes or opts out, you are not permitted to target him or her with further CEMs. We recommend that you always get consent from the customer before sending further communications. In terms of this product, this type of contact applies to leads obtained by a form submission through your Dealer Smart Solutions website only. Any leads from autoTRADER.ca are excluded. So to fulfill one of the requirements of Canada's anti-spam legislation within the DSS product, Trader has made available a CASL compliant consent notice. Please see the example contained within this slide. The notice can be enabled by the dealer on all forms hosted on the Dealer Smart Solutions website. When enabled, forms will contain a consent notice, corresponding consent, and non-consent checkboxes and hyperlinks to privacy policy, if available, and Contact Us pages. If you create your own form, we recommend you use this template or consult the CASL website. Here we present several examples of web forms with compliant commercial electronic message consent notices, corresponding checkboxes, and the links to pages that contain contact details. We've updated the page forms, pop-up modal, inline forms, and you'll notice that the checkboxes are not checked on, and they are not required fields. But since we have a substantial amount of dealers handling and collecting leads through inbound telephone calls, let's take some time to address how these can be handled while complying with CASL requirements. It is imperative to note that CASL extends beyond digital marketing communications and applies to lead or contact details collected via inbound telephone calls. Here's what steps you need to take into consideration to ensure compliance. If a lead comes through the phone and you desire to obtain express consent, it is advised you direct the prospective customer to fill out a form posted on your DSS website, for instance, the Request More Information form. If you are successful in obtaining express consent through the web form, you're permitted to respond to the original inquiry and target contact with additional CEMs up until that contact unsubscribes. In cases where you're not successful in capturing consent via web form submission, in addition to the phone-based inquiry, you are not permitted to respond to the inquiry by email or send additional CEMs. Please note that telephone call recordings are only stored in Control Center for a period of 30 days. Consent provided via telephone cannot be tracked, and as such, it is not advised to collect verbal express consent. It is always best to direct the inquiring party to a web form to properly collect express consent. To comply with other requirements of CASL going forward, Control Center will maintain a date and timestamp and consent choice for each contact or lead record, detailed in the screen capture within this slide. Please note the new fields including do not send CEM for consenting leads, the date and timestamp, and the tracking of the compliant consent text. As discussed in the previous slide, Control Center will update consent status in real time based on a customer's or contact communication preferences. As a reminder, if in a subsequent form submission a contact opts in, the corresponding record in Control Center will be updated from opt-out, no consent, to opt-in, express consent. The same applies when the scenario is reversed. So again, tying back to information in a previous slide, scripted prescribed information can be enabled in all email communications sent from within Control Center. The prescribed information as part of an outbound email communication includes your business name and email address, contact details, including a physical mailing address, telephone number, website address, and an easy and cost-free option to provide an opportunity for the recipient to unsubscribe. Trader will also be rolling out a pre-canned unsubscribe page to all Dealer Smart Solutions customers to enable you to track contacts and leads who desire to opt out of your email marketing program and future CEMs in order to attempt to streamline this essential process. An example of a generic unsubscribe form is presented within this slide. Note, communications from Control Center will already have an unsubscribe mechanism. Those using a third-party ESP should ensure the unsubscribe mechanism is included. Within Control Center, you also have the ability to set up a lead alert, which deploys a notification email to the pre-selected address within the configuration or preferences of this feature, once a new lead is populated to the database. When enabled, upon successful form completion, a lead notification will be sent to the pre-selected address containing a consent notice for leads who consent to CEMs directly within the additional information section of the message. And to wrap things up, with the changes to our solutions, this notice to our customers to export lead or contact records from Control Center to a third-party platform, particularly a third-party CRM. When exporting leads or contacts from Control Center to your internal platform or system, please ensure the transfer consent choice and the corresponding date and timestamp for every single record. By doing so, you can ensure that you are classifying consenting, non-consenting, and no consent selected leads within your internal platform or system. So we've gone through all the content we have prepared for this webinar. I will now go through some of the most relevant and repeated questions submitted by our audience members. Our moderator has selected a handful of questions that we will address. So the first question is from Mike. Will a copy of this presentation be provided after the webinar? Yes, please look out for an email from Trader containing a link to a downloadable copy of this presentation and a recording of the webinar. Second question is from Mohammed. Is an inquiry through a chat implied consent? Simply put, it is not. When in doubt, please refer prospective customers to a web form with consent enabled. This allows you to capture express consent. And the third question from David. When does this law take effect? CASL takes effect July 1st, 2014. So to conclude today's webinar, please find within this slide links to accredited and official sources for more information pertaining to Canada's anti-spam legislation. On behalf of Trader, thank you for attending and participating in today's event. We hope you have provided sufficient details about the legislation, a variety of best practices, and some valuable context in respect to the changes to our solutions. Please stay tuned for a follow-up email containing a recording of this webinar, a downloadable copy of this deck, and instructions on how to request CASL-compliant forms for your DSS website. Thank you, and have a great remainder of your day.